All right. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Distinguished Speaker Seminar Series. I'm Mike Titel, the director of the UCLA Johnson Comprehensive Cancer Center, and it's really a great privilege to introduce today's distinguished speaker, Dr. Robert Winn. He is a fellow NCI designated Cancer Center director who leads the Virginia Commonwealth University Massey Cancer Center. Dr. Winn is also a professor of medicine, the Senior Associate Dean for Cancer Innovation, and Lippman Chair in Oncology at VCU. Dr. Winn is an alumnus of Notre Dame University and received a medical degree with AOA distinction from the University of Michigan prior to internship and residency at St. Luke's Medical Center in Chicago, which he then followed with a pulmonary medicine and critical care fellowship at the University of Colorado Health Sciences Center in Denver. He rose to assistant to associate professor at Colorado Health Sciences before moving to the University of Illinois as a professor and associate vice chancellor of health affairs and director of the University of Illinois Cancer Center. In 2019, Dr. Winn moved to his current position as director of the VCU Massey Cancer Center. As a pulmonologist, Dr. Winn is committed to community engaged research centered on eliminating health disparities. He is a principal investigator on several community-based projects funded by the NIH and National Cancer Institute, including the All of Us Research Program, which is an NIH precision medicine initiative. He's received national and international acclaim for his efforts to empower underserved patient populations, to improve healthcare delivery, and to ensure equal access to cancer for all. Dr. Winn has received numerous awards and honors. One of them would be the National Cancer Institute's Center to Reduce Cancer Health Disparities Cure Program Lifetime Achievement Award. He's also received the AACI Cancer Health Equity Award. He's a member of the National Cancer Policy Forum of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and of numerous professional societies. He's also vice president and president-elect of the Association of American Cancer Institutes Board of Directors. He is on the Department of Veteran Affairs Federal Advisory Board, and he serves on at least 12 external advisory boards for major cancer centers in the United States. He has 6 active NIH awards in lung cancer and health equity research, and has 76 and more peer-reviewed publications and 5 book chapters. I apologize for the slight technical delay that was on our end, and it's really a great pleasure now to invite Dr. Winn to provide his distinguished seminar today, which for us is unfortunate that it's remote, and this is entitled Structure, Trust, and Science. Dr. Winn, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation and for spending some time with me today. I'd like to, again, Dr. Titel, I'd also like to thank Dr. Dubinet and Dr. Rebus, who have been long-standing colleagues in my research efforts as well as other things. This talk is going to be a little bit different, so let me just tell you up front. It's going to be focused on a couple things, but very much it's going to be trying to make the pitch about why we need to get out of just thinking about DNA, and why I'm going to be talking about not just DNA in the genome, but what I consider to be ZNA, that is the zip code neighborhood association, and the genome that I'm calling it and coining that term in the context of how the place and space actually plays a role in impacting the biology that we see and how the structure actually fits in with that. Next slide. This is my financial disclosures. I will not be discussing any off-label use or any investigational use in this presentation or any others. Next slide. Is this in presentation mode? Thank you. Next slide. I'll start off with this slide. This is one of my favorite sayings attributed to Mark Twain. It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And I use that in a context of understanding that as we're moving through science and as we're starting to talk about the science of health equity, there are things that we believe we know for sure that just ain't so, that tends to get us into trouble. Next slide. I want to break down and define what I'm talking about specifically as I use these terms. When I think about health differences are the outcomes, the different outcomes between two groups based on specific characteristics. When I use the phrase health equity, I am specifically talking about a principle that is the underlying principle of a total commitment to reducing and ultimately eliminating disparities in health and its determinants. When I use the phrase disparities, while not all differences are disparities, health disparities are really rooted in the context of social justice. Next slide. So this talk will be rooted in that framework of a health disparities in the context of social justice and looking at it through the lens of the impact of science and the interrelation between science and social justice. Next slide. When I think of science, I think of the three phases of science, right? So let me just, build this framework for you. The latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, all the way to the mid 20th century, was focused on the study of energy and matter. It was the understanding of how does the atom actually, how do we get better understanding of the physics? How do we get better understanding of the nature of the natural world around us so that we can understand how the matter, right, can be transformed to energy? In that context, there are many amazing scientific discoveries that sort of happened, but that was the focus. If you go back to what was the focus of our research endeavors in the latter part of the 19th century and all the way to the 1950s in the 20th century. But in the 1950s, this group of Crick, Watson, and Franklin, via Photo 51, was a discovery that changed the science from looking at just matter and energy into being the first time we were really able to understand the nature of the human cell. That unleashed a flood of research that allowed us, next slide, to produce the next generation, if we can get to the next slide. No problem, thank you. That allowed us to get to this next generation of researchers who very much like, and we can maybe just go to the smaller slide if that works better, that's fine. Who folks like David Baltimore, who would ultimately discover reverse transcriptase, people like Philip Sharp, who looked at the whole context of the split genes, and James Allison, that foundational discovery of the DNA actually allowed for a frenzy of research and a flood of research to really start understanding why we got oncogenes, tumor suppression, all the rest of that. This translated into, next slide, the ability in 1971, which we celebrated the 50th anniversary last year, of the National Cancer Act, which did what? We were to harness all the science that we knew about the nature of the human cell and its relationship to cancer. And the goal in 1971 was to do what? Was to eradicate cancer because we had understood the science by 1981. Next slide. That event allowed us to go from the original three designated cancer centers, MD Anderson, Memorial Sloan, Roswell, to ultimately 71 current centers that are designated throughout the country to do what? Research that allows us to reduce and attack and better understand cancer. Next slide. I'd argue that in that 50 years, we've certainly have made progress. Clearly, the science has allowed us to do amazing things. But I'd also argue that unlike the thinking in 1971 that cancer would be eradicated by 1981, that the science is certainly necessary, but not sufficient to eradicate cancer. I'd also make that argument when it comes to Black-white gaps when it comes to cancer death. This is a report that I helped put together with many other people with the AACR's first cancer disparities report, in which we were able to show that from the 1990s to present day, we were able to certainly reduce cancer deaths between Black and whites from the 33% that it was in the 1990s down to now the teens. Next slide. But we certainly haven't eradicated it. The truth of the matter is, if you still look at the differences of Black-white outcomes for prostate cancer or breast cancer, you'll see that. You'll also see things like leukemias in Latino, Latinx kids and teens that actually get it more frequently and have a poorer outcome compared to their Caucasian colleagues. And interestingly enough, you'll even see geographic differences. Interesting enough, a 70-year-old white male living in Utah versus a 70-year-old white male living in Kentucky, the white male living in Kentucky still has 3.5 times higher incidence of getting lung cancer and having a poor outcome. I actually think that this argument about unleashing just understanding the science alone certainly is an important role. And discovery science will always play a foundational role in cancer. But I submit to you that it in and of itself is not sufficient to close the gap, particularly the disparities gap. Next slide. Having said that, the truth of the matter is that, and I find this is work that, and Dr. Brawley and I have been talking about this, and I'm sure you've probably heard this from Dr. Otis Brawley, with every new scientific progress, the science field of science has inadvertently increased disparities. I'll say that again. With every new scientific discovery, whether it's a drug, whether it's technology, it has inadvertently increased disparities between populations. You can see this in breast cancer, and I'll show you a slide about that, but you can see it in colorectal cancers. You can see this in almost every single thing that has been created, including immunotherapy, by the way. In 2016, 2017, and 2018, we were writing about the immunotherapy divide. I say this because we are, as scientists in the 21st century, have to be much more mindful of the limitations of science and the actual advancements that cancer centers can do by being more deliberate and focused on the fact that as we move towards immunotherapy, precision medicine, and the next therapies, that we're more deliberate in making sure that we don't disadvantage some groups by only rolling out these miracle cures and these miracle technologies to the few. Next slide. This is a slide that I just, took back and just used this from Dr. Siegel, all the rest of that, who just shows that once the advent of the mammography came in, the differences between Black-white deaths between women with breast cancer increased as a result of that, among other things. But certainly you can see where you have the advent and the introduction of this technology and the unintended consequence of widening the disparity gap. Next slide. I think about this, and hit it again, if you would. I would click it again, if you can. This is important to me because as we're talking about artificial intelligence, I am convinced certainly that many of the machine learning, artificial intelligence, and the methods will be able to do what we actually wanted to do, which is predict future risk of breast cancer. But I fear that it will be only for some and not for all. The picture to your left is actually while I was on the south side of Chicago, taken by Dr. Catherine Tosis, that shows you that they are reviewing a mammography, non-digital, by the way, analog. And the reason why everybody in that room is covering up their face is because at the time where this hospital existed and that reading room was, there was a live manhole. So just because you talk to me about artificial intelligence and machine learning, again, doesn't mean that it's going to, without deliberate thinking, benefit all without inadvertently disadvantaging some, particularly if we're not thoughtful about the approach and how we roll things out. Next slide. I think about screening, the National Cancer Screening Trial, that less than 4% of the people on this study in the New England Journal, which was a seminal paper looking at low-dose lung cancer screening and the reduction of 20% mortality by employing, by rolling this out and using this, and less than 4% were minorities in the study. Next slide. Interesting enough, all of our lung cancer risk predictive models didn't work when we actually started to take them out of the 70 kg white male sort of population into using them for others, particularly like African Americans, because there was no real representation. Next slide. The funny part about technology and the funny part about all what I've just said is that we looked at all these wonderful advances, but one of the things that actually makes me think about, again, the limitations of science. And if we're not careful of thinking about not only the health delivery, but the communication of deliberately bringing in our communities closer to our science, we are sure to make scientific progress. We are sure to come up with the numerical drugs and cures. My biggest fear isn't that we're going to not have that progress. My biggest fear is that we'll lose public trust. Now, here's an interesting finding that I thought was just somewhat interesting. That with the lung cancer screening protocol if you would, 2010 or NLST and then post NLST, you would have proposed that post NLST, the National Lung Cancer Screening Trial, our uptake post policy, our uptake for lung cancer screening would have been through the roof. It wasn't. Next slide. This again tells me that when academic cancer center says they will build it, doesn't necessarily mean that they will come. And so I think that it's high time that just like the 19th century, we thought about matter, we thought about energy, just like in the early part of the 20th century, by 1950, we started thinking about the nature of the human cell as really understanding the science. This is a science for understanding how place and space matter. And what role does place and space play in the biology? And I'm not convinced that just because you build it, people will come, particularly if they don't have trust. Next slide. This is a slide that it came out of work done by the NCCN and the ACS. And all I want to point out is imagine you have 8,000 oncologists. They're not asking them individually like, hey, is the outcome of your patients of color and non-patients of color or white patients the same? They're asking the individual, hey, what do they think about the field of oncology? And interestingly enough, when they were asked, it turns out that over 62% of those people who were asked whether they thought that the outcomes of their patients of color and the outcomes of their white patients were the same, 62% said they weren't. In fact, they were probably worse for the people of color. Oncologists. Next slide. As we're thinking about that, what did COVID do? COVID, for many of us, did not actually do anything new other than it gave us time to pause so that others would actually understand that there have been these issues that have been longstanding. Next slide. I put this in just to remind us that as we're getting further out from George Floyd, that we never forget that day in which many of us saw on the TV screen a man literally in 8 minutes, 46 seconds having his life snuffed out. I think sometimes we have to recenter ourselves to why over the last 2 years we've been making these issues about how to diversify science and how to bring hopefully science closer to our community so it would better benefit them. Next slide. It's not new. For some of you who've heard me, you know that from 1918, there was also a flu pandemic. The flu pandemic of 1918 that killed 675,000 people, Americans at the time in the United States, when we only had 100 million people. But the next slide, you may be surprised by. The next slide was as we were having that pandemic from about 1918 to about 1921, we were also having some of the worst racial upheaval in the United States. This is the Tulsa Massacre or the Elaine Massacre that happened in Elaine, Arkansas, where over 200 people in a 48-hour period were killed just for being Black. But that wasn't happening just in Tulsa, Oklahoma and Arkansas. It was happening in Detroit. It was happening in California. It was happening in Philadelphia and DC and all over the country. So this isn't the first time that we've had the stress of a pandemic and racial unrest. But the question is, what are we going to do the next time? How do we prepare for the next pandemic? How do we prepare people, our patients and our communities, so that they would come out on the other end better than we even have in 1918 and that we have done in 2020? Next slide. None of this is new. I know many of us have experts on our campus that are health disparities experts or health equity experts, and many of us have been here 20, 30, and 40 years. I don't care. W.E.B. Du Bois in 1899, go back and check it out yourself if you don't believe me, wrote the definitive paper, back then called the Philadelphia paper, in which he described many of the issues that we are having currently today. The issues of housing, unequal education, poverty, crime, the issues of the differences in health outcomes. So it's funny to me that we frequently, those of us who have been in this field, occasionally sometimes are shocked when people talk about, well, this is new. There are nuances with the digital divide and other things, but the core issues remain the core issues. Next slide. I find this interesting because as we talk about moving through, people keep saying, Rob, Winn, your focus should be on science. Well, I am focusing on the science, that third wave of science, that DNA of science, that zip code and neighborhood of association and how that plays a role in the very science we tend to carry out. I'm not going to go over this slide because many of you know this is back. Obviously, this was not a great moment for medicine, where one of our colleagues once sort of said, well, doctors can't be racist. That was the craziest thing anybody could say. I'm sure they never talked to any of their patients of color. But more importantly, I'm sure they never even heard of or at that moment just had a slip, because we would have understood that the United States Public Health Syphilis Study of 1932 or J. Marion Sims using slaves, right, to ultimately perfect the work on modern day surgical gynecology in repairing fistulas was inherently biased. Next slide. We've all known that, whether it's the Nature magazines, the Cells and whatever, that there is bias. Let's just call it what it is. Sometimes people will say, well, it's just, there's a one standard and folks don't meet the standard. Well, the funny part about standards are that it's only standard if you're looking at it. Classical music is standard. And so one would argue that, well, if you can't play classical music, what good is there to have a Charlie Bird talk in jazz? So stop this silliness. Next slide. I've come to recognize that the genome impacts cells. And what I am is I started off as an epithelial cell biologist, lung cancer guy, right? And used to really be fascinated about what would go wrong with the individual cell, the epithelial cell that then would actually cause other cells to, until I ran into Joan Brugge and Mina Bissell, who informed me that the stroma that surrounded those epithelial cells was not inert. There was a conversation, an interplay between the stroma and the epithelial cells that allowed, right, for this epithelial cell to create damage. And that's when I got the idea that we have become so comfortable with understanding things at a micro or cellular, individual cellular level, and understanding the association with the genome, and then maybe the association that the genome impacts the cells like the community, AKA the genome, impacts the individual. So if we want to be able to understand an individual cell and what the stroma and what the immune system around that individual cell plays, we also, when we're thinking about population health, have to now start thinking about the individual and the interplay it has, or she, or whatever has within that stroma. How that, that genome impacts the individual person. Next slide. I put that here because when I think about ZNA, the zip code neighborhood, and why it matters, I just snapshot. I can take this in California, anywhere else, but this is picking on Chicago just for a second. You'll see a slide here. It'll have depicted the life expectancy of folk in Chicago that live in an affluent area called the Gold Coast, or the coast, right? If you look at that loop and the coast, the life expectancy there is roughly 85. If you go literally 4 miles west, that's only like 4 or 5 train stops. To West Garfield Park, you have a 16-year decrease in life expectancy. And by the way, if you go 8 miles south of where the loop is, now you're into the area of Englewood, south, what's called South Chicago, you have a 30-year decrease. Hold on. I know what you're saying. Rob, Dr. Winn, this could all be explained by gun violence and all the rest of the stuff in Chicago. And in fact, the work by Steve Wolf and others would show that that is not the case. In fact, that's negligible. So when we start thinking about these life expectancy differences, not just in cancer, but just overall, I'm not buying that it's just that African Americans are biologically just more predisposed to more disease. And I'm going to show you why I believe that structure plays a role, how the place and space plays a role in contributing to that, and not just because of gun violence. Next slide. This is just a slide that talks about, this is something where the American College of Radiology was trying to have these breast cancer centers, imaging centers of excellence. And the funny part is when I have the slide from back in the day, my daughter at the time was 11 and she would say, well, Dad, I don't really get it. If the pink is where most women are dying, then why aren't those pink ribbons there? And ultimately, this is a little bit the Sutton principle, right? Why do you rob a bank? Because that's where the money is. I'm not quite certain that many of our efforts, and I know you all at UCLA have been the leaders in this about being in the community, but most of our academic communities and centers are not. Next slide. I'm going to focus a little bit on why this hashtag of social determinants of health, we should stop hashtagging and understand that the social determinants of health have actually been determined by structure. And so academic centers have for decades, as we've talked about since the 1950s and others, have focused on the fundamental research and downstream factors, almost to the exclusion in some cases of the upstream determinants. Next slide. So a passion of mine, in addition to RNA binding protein and protein methylation, has been the impact of social determinants of health on our health as communities. And we've had a number of things at the National Academy and the National Cancer Policy Forum to really bring about this issue around food insecurity, transportation, and other things, which I won't talk about today. Next slide. And this is just pointing out the fact that, looking at data is actually going to be important as we move on. So I think this third wave is going to be not just understanding the nature of the human cell, but understanding data and place and space, and how understanding that all and putting that together, we'll have a better idea about how to have interventions into our biology. Next slide. I'm going to break this down about why structure matters, and so why I stopped hashtagging social determinants of health. So let's go back and understand how social determinants of health were created, okay? Homer Hoyt, University of Wisconsin grad, University of Chicago, Fair Housing Act, 1933, when FDR was trying to actually make it all fair for people to get homes. It was Homer Hoyt who actually, based on one of his works as a graduate student, getting his thesis, stumbled upon this thing that, using the science of the day, which is eugenics, understanding that if you were to use eugenics as a backdrop, you'd be able to understand of telling banks who, if we gave the money to, would pay you back sooner. So there was an entire list of how this actually ran out and who was on the pecking order. Bottom line, let's take Richmond, 1935. The pink and the red, or the red and the yellow indicates the undesirable areas of town. That would be called the East End. We still call it the East End, even as we speak today. The West End, however, is usually depicted there in most of the blue and green spaces. Those are the areas where, based on eugenics and other things by Homer Hoyt and other things like that, you could actually come up with tiers, and that would be your best bet of giving people money so that the businesses would get their money back. I mean, it was an interesting sort of time. So when we start talking about redlining, we really want to know more than just the hashtag redline, just like the hashtag social determinants of health, and be able to understand how this actually has set up structures that I believe are impacting our biology today. Next slide. So when I think about this, I understand that there was redlining and all the rest of these other things, but interestingly enough, that East End, despite the redlining, just like in Tulsa, just like in many other areas of the United States, thrived. Independent of well, it wasn't great, but these areas were able to establish their own banks, their own grocers, their own business, their own commerce, et cetera, et cetera. So it wasn't so much that the redlining, right, is the structure. It allowed for sanctioned segregation, okay? And we can do this with many other groups. I'm picking on right now just African Americans because that's what the data that I have readily available. But I can do this and show this with many other groups. Next slide. So it wasn't so much the redlining, but the next thing that most of us tend to forget, the urban renewal, otherwise known as the slum clearance programs, otherwise known as building white roads through black bedrooms, that literally devastated communities throughout the United States, including in California, where the highways really divided robust communities. And in fact, to this day, you can trace that effort of building these white roads through black bedrooms, the urban renewal programs of the 50s, of the 60s, as decimating many of these communities. But hold on, wait a minute. It's not so much that the roads were actually built through them. There was a consequence of the roads being built through these communities that I'm worried about. Next slide. For example, as these roads got built, we understand that the diesel and all the rest of that stuff. In fact, you have researchers right now in California who are looking at the areas of poor areas and diesel concentration and the result of cancer, et cetera. So you have really amazing researchers out throughout California who are starting to look at this. But I know for a fact that in addition to those types of deals, those communities which were designated as slums. If you said, well, why are they designated as slums? How can you designate the East End Jackson, which the I-95 ran straight through, as being one of the Black Wall Streets, even in the 50s, as being a slum? Not only did the road go through Jackson, but different commerces, different businesses that were much more hazardous to those communities were set up in these places because they were considered to be less desirable. So quit talking about this issue, how Blacks are just simply more predisposed to being disease prone, without understanding the structure that contributes. I actually think that strengthens even my basic science. In fact, I've told my basic scientists that we have done the bench to bedside for so long that we need to be moving more towards a people to pipette model in which we're understanding the communities so that it would understand the data that could help refine our scientific questions, as opposed to us driving the scientific questions and then moving to these communities and then having it corroborated because clearly they have poor outcomes. We have to understand the structure, there's place in space, and how the place in space contributes to disease. Next slide. This is just looking at particulate matter 2.5 and its association with cancer. And this is work that's done by, a wonderful researcher named Geffen from the University of Illinois, who sees that there's disproportionate and systemically disproportionate impacts of particulate 2.5 matters on populations of color. Next slide. This plays into our heat islands. Most of you are actually starting to finally understand that the truth of the matter is that we understand that, interestingly enough, some of the more hottest areas surface temperatures that we actually have in some of our cities are associated also with the poorest areas. And this urban heat island sort of phenomena is also contributing to chronic disease, including cancer. Next slide. This is just what it looks like, our urban heat island here. That Jackson Ward that we were talking about, that the Harlem of the South, the sort of Black Wall Street and all the rest of that, devastated by not only the I-95 running straight through it and other companies, but the interesting thing is it's been deforested, and so the foliage and all the rest of that is gone. This is our East End. This is where now called Gilpin Court, which was the epicenter of those banks and things that I had been talking to you about in the 1940s and the 1950s of African-American communities in Richmond. This is what it looks like today versus the West End, which is still property value, some of the best property value within Richmond. And by the way, a 7-point difference in temperature, surface temperature. Next slide. Trust. This is what I'm going to tell you. At the end of the day, I believe that we need to get away from the conversations of African Americans just being more predisposed to without understanding the structure. I think that it's actually not exactly a complete argument. And I think that we erroneously actually assume some biological issues that will get us someplace, but I believe that there will be much richer discussion, much richer levels of scientific questions to be asked if we took into account the structure. Now, the truth of the matter is, where do I get trust from? That's the first thing I got from COVID, right? Structure matters. The second thing I got is that trust matters too. Turns out that you can have a miracle drug, an American modern day marvel. And interesting enough, even though you could even demonstrate to people that your vaccine is wonderful, it doesn't mean people won't take it. Again, Eric Lander and I are in total agreement that scientific progress will continue, miracle drugs will continue. But what we are at a cross section right now is losing public trust. I think one element certainly is going to be this interplay between place and space and biology. But the other thing we must pay attention to, particularly as academic centers, particularly as academic cancer centers, is regaining public trust. Next slide. Why would people not trust us? Interesting enough, this is by one of our professors that we have here named Utsi, who actually understands that the folklore around many African-American communities, you can go in Philadelphia, South Side Chicago, West Side, you can talk about even, I have my cousins, they live right in, where is it, Compton up in your area, about these old wives' tales we used to say of not going out at night and why older people used to be worried about us going out as being African-American at night. And then you find out the truth of the matter is that there is a whole history across the United States of body snatchers. Of people who identified when African Americans would die. And because we needed their bodies and because we were few on them and we needed their bodies to do anatomy and understand science, we literally robbed their bodies from their graves. It's not something I've come up with. There is a history that's actually being here. You want to talk about trust? Next slide. And I'll get through these in the next couple of minutes. Henrietta Lacks. I think about Henrietta Lacks not so much in the context of how they use their cervical cells. I think of Henrietta Lacks in the context of the March on Scientific Progress. We went from matter and energy, latter part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century. Watson, Crick, Franklin then discovered the DNA. We unleash a fury of research around the nature of the human cell. And in that march towards making progress, we exhibited an ugly display of the lack of humanity for this woman named Henrietta Lacks. This 30-year-old came in with cervical cancer. Interesting enough, as we talked about how Henrietta Lacks cells, and there's movies about her, and how we credit her for her cells and helping us to come up with a polio vaccine, and how many pharma companies actually profited from that. Not once did anyone talk about the families and the families and the families and the descendants of the people who've used those cells in pharma company benefited from those resources, but Henrietta Lacks's family did not. Next slide. These are some of the other violations. It's not just the United States public health syphilis study. Interestingly enough, in Puerto Rico from 1956 to 1960, almost a third of the women on that island were sterilized without their consent or knowledge. So when people say to me, I don't understand, Rob, why people would not trust us. Just like our unfortunate colleague who said that doctors can't be racist, that doesn't come, I don't think, entirely from a mean spirit, but it does come from a place of lack of knowledge, of lack of humility. Next slide. Many of our institutions grow certainly richer while the neighbors right 2 blocks away stay sicker. This is a story that came out in 2017 about how one institution or one, in this case, the Cleveland Clinic was a global success story, but right around a couple blocks away, its communities were mired in poverty. You can tell that story, not just about the Cleveland Clinic, but about many of us. Next slide. The other thing I learned that during this whole issue was that when our anchor institutions closed and there was no trust of science and no trust of doctors, the interesting thing is there was trust of the community. Now, these are the 4 pillars that Martin Luther King famously said were the 4 pillars of the African-American community, including the press, professional organization, fraternities, sororities, and the clergy. Interesting enough, we had to turn to our community to be able to get effective information out, not only about COVID, but about cancer screening. Next slide. We created something called a Facts and Faith Friday, which was essentially how your faith is not at war with your facts and not at war with facts. And ultimately, the champions of this were Rudy Mercer Haynes, a lawyer and community activist, and Pastor Todd Gray of the historic Fifth Street Baptist Church and I got together. I know it sounds funny, a pastor, a lawyer, and a doctor get together, but that's what happened. And ultimately, we figured out that it wasn't going to be enough for us to send out, quote, shiny faces from our academic institutions to talk about this, but we had to engage and employ people from the community to be able to effectively carry that voice. As a result of that, next slide, I'm almost done. We had people like Dr. Fauci and many others coming through to really give firsthand account of what they were thinking about in the context of the vaccines. We've also had Francis Collins and Ned Sharpless and many others who the community is asking to meet. Next slide. I say all this because I have now been convinced that trust is not something that you, quote, just build just because you show up. Turns out that the community has helped me sort of look at the relevance of what we do, that frequently we do these events and then we're gone, or we have a grant and it's about 2 years, and after 2 years, we're gone. If we're going to be committed to a community, it has to be longer than the period of some soft money. The other thing I learned about was the accessibility has to be that once you're on the screen and you're giving out information, but once the Zoom screen is off, you still need to be accessible. And you know what? The most important thing I learned was flexibility. We were sometimes having, guest speakers or these people important to us, but interesting, if we went to the community would say, Dr. Winn, I appreciate that. And maybe we can have them, I know they're from the CDC and all, maybe we can have them speak for 10 minutes, but we have to speak about this issue. But what I learned most is that all of us have been building trust in some cases for 30, 40 years. But almost none of us have trustworthiness scales, meaning what is our institutional trustworthiness? How is it measured? I've worked with the NCCN and ACS to develop a health equity, the first ever health equity real report card that I'm employing and using in my health system. But the other thing I'm working on now with Ruben Warren and David Williams and some others, and Dr. Mays, is this issue on institutional trustworthiness. And how do you measure that so that you know if you're even ready to be able to engage the trust of the community. It's a concept whose time has come. Next slide. That's why I've been so happy that, a lot of things, as a cancer center director, make me pull out my hair. But to be honest with you, it pulls out my hair sometimes in a good way, because this concept of responsive research, that we are doing research that impacts our catchment area, is not small and it's not lost on me. Next slide. Click it 3 times, please. Well, no, just go back. I'm sorry. Got ahead of myself. This whole thing that Harold Freeman described about our focus on discovery science, and believe me, I love science. If loving science is wrong, I don't want to be right. I love my RNA binding protein. But the more and the older I get, the more I recognize that whether it's molecular targeted therapy, whether it's immunotherapy, whether it's whatever new vaccine therapy, it has limitations. If we don't actually focus on the delivery and the health delivery of that, and the other bridge, the trust issue. Next slide. I'm moved from using useful data like we use all the time to usable data. And I'll give you an example of that. I say that a hammer is useful. Just like most of our data is useful to us. But if you're trying to swim, it's not very usable. Lots of data we generate may be useful to the experts, but not very usable for anybody else outside of the experts. And that is something that I think we need to also address that will help us in getting back trust. Next slide. I only got 2 more and I'm done. Next slide. When I go in and I talk to someone who's a lung cancer patient, and I say, listen, you got a spot on your, the upper part of your left lung, this is data. Before I even start to actually talk to my patients, I always start off with their image, because once we can actually have an image and they can say that this is your slide, this is, I never go and say, well, this is not exactly your CAT scan, this is somebody from Arkansas, but the spot is kind of near there. We do that with data to our communities. What happens if you're able to change the conversation, says that's your spot, taken on, remember when you had that CAT scan, there was a sticky factor. The question is, what is the sticky factor of dissemination that we can actually bring to our communities? Next slide. So we started this work in Chicago when I was there, about doing what I called at that point, developing what we call ward-based approaches or community-based approaches. And I'll explain that to you in a second. Next slide. So here's the deal. I started thinking that only male people in academics know zip codes, but that was a zip code. But interestingly enough, I wanted to get information that the communities, and particularly in Chicago, they understood that they had districts or wards. In fact, the city of Chicago, just like Rockford and Peoria, we can actually do this for everything. We started with the cities, though. There were 50 different wards. And in each of these wards, we can get information. Now, people would say, well, why are you actually getting information about the wards? And please, next slide. We were getting information about the ward because we knew that people vote. And when people voted, there had to be somebody in that voting district, because the data on voting districts and the data on voting from all parties is pretty robust. So we took the concept that instead of looking at zip codes, we looked at the way we actually had places divided up where they voted. We were able to, in this case, be able to show in the 20th ward, which is one of the areas in Englewood that I told you about, with a 30-year reduction of life expectancy, and also Bernie Mac comes from and Derek Rose, if anybody's counting. But one of the things that was interesting to me is, I can't show it here, but the prostate cancer, for example, we were looking at in that area when we were talking about not screening, screen, not screen. Turns out that those men in the 20th ward of Chicago had 3 times more deaths from prostate cancer than compared to the rest of the state and to the US. That changed the conversation that we were able to have. It now meant that I'm not just getting information that is just academically intriguing, or, as I said, I've been pursuing academic excellence all my life, but over these last 10 years, I've been more driven towards pursuing academic relevance. That the data I get allows me obviously to put together grants, put together new knowledge, put together papers, but the data I get actually allows me to get with other partners that actually also have resources and potentially skin in the game to make a difference. The good news about this story is that the alderman then and the older person after, as a result of these data, were able to partner not only with the University of Illinois and University of Chicago, but with other groups to really come up with strategic interventions similar to what you all are doing, which are FQHCs and other things within the LA area. This was driven in 2016 by a thirst to say most people don't know their community data. Most people don't know in the healthcare providers don't know the universe that they're taking care of. And this was trying to get data that drove it down, not just to some zip code that the mailman knows or some academic person knows, but to drive it down to something that I can actually have a conversation with the people who are in that district and the hospitals and the community health centers within that district and the people within the barbershop who knew that they were in that district. Next slide. And I think that this is coming up. Next slide, just click it a couple times. Yep, there it is. So this is a whole talk that I think that part of building trust is going to be consistently showing up, not having it be on soft money, but providing a type of conversation and back and forth data for our communities. We're full of lots of genomics. I mean, we got a ton of omics, lipidomics, phenomics, genomics, a whole bunch of omics. But there's one omic an important omic that has been missing in all these conversations, and that's the term we coined as community omics. We're finding that the more we can get language and the omics of the community and package it in a way that we have our council people, our aldermen, our state reps, our state senators, and in addition to everybody else, are the guy who's in the barbershop on the Eastern Richmond, who's right here, you know, in Churchill. Once I can actually get data in a way that they understand it, it's so much easier to get partners. It's like the CAT scan with a spot on the left upper part of your lung. When you see it and you know it, and it's easy to understand, there's action that's usually associated with that. I think I only have 1 or 2 slides left. Next slide. This is an approach that we're trying to do in the context of the Stand Up to Cancer grant we have and a SPORE that I'm working with, as you see here, the City of Hope and MUSC in the context of using multi-level approaches. One of the things that I'm really proud of is that we actually understand that even our freaking navigation has been fragmented. So we're trying to make an attempt that not only do we have community health navigators that are connected and talking based back and forth with our health system navigators, but that they're both connected and joined at the hips in a way of communicating with our financial navigators as well. Because when you start talking about the social determinants of health, it ain't all just about housing and about food insecurity that where people don't get to see docs. It's about sometimes transportation and certainly about financial toxicity. So we need to stop talking around the issues and address these issues head on. Next slide. This is just something that we're doing. We're trying to refine our data captures a little bit better with SAS. There's an announcement that went out a couple of weeks ago that we have a analytics hub, and I'm really proud of it because we're really granulating things down, not only in political districts, but we can do rural political districts, the whole nine, about figuring out cancer health so that we can actually have other people that we could talk to. Next slide. I'm ending on this. In 1969, on the eve of the Apollo 11 launch, putting the first man on the moon, Ralph Abernathy, who's one of the giants of the civil rights era, along with Martin Luther King and Rebel Shuttleworth and many others, actually stood firm that he made so much ruckus before that launch that ultimately the deputy of NASA had to come out and talk to him to see if they can actually have him back down and not talk so much about this because it was important to the country. They had this wonderful conversation. I want to tell you about this, though. At the end of the day, Ralph Abernathy said, I appreciate your science, and God knows, you know, what this is amazing for America. This is a moment we all share in pride. But why can you do that, but you can't actually pay any attention to the poverty that's right around you? And that's in my communities. And Deputy Payne responded, because it's easier to put a man on the moon than it is to address these issues. Next slide. In 2021, it still feels as if it's easier to put one of your neighbors into space than it is to deal with these issues. And this is why we are in the 21st century as cancer center directors, hoping to add to the conversation of how we can reimagine what a 21st century cancer center does. I am proud to know that we are going to put forward new drugs. I'm proud to know that we're going to put forward new technologies. But I'm also aware that every time we do that, we sometimes inadvertently increase disparities. And I like to say, to change the conversation, to say, how do we be more deliberate about getting the wonderful things that we do at our cancer centers into the hands to benefit many, many more communities. That's the end of my talk. I know I probably overstayed my welcome. And you guys are probably happy I wasn't there physically because I probably wore you out. But that's my talk, and I just want to say thank you. And I think there's one more slide. Yep, this is the slide. The only important thing is to show you my grandmother. She's 95, who actually told me that the one good thing that she said is that as you get smarter, please don't get dumber. And what she meant by that is to make sure that I maintain the grace and humility to understand that as I got more knowledge, that didn't mean that I had everything. It was just a start. And as one woman told me in the South Side of Chicago, and I had one of my scientists at a town hall who stood up one day and said, you know, it's unfortunate that you people are so scientifically illiterate. This 87-year-old woman stood up and said, well, doctor, what she said, we might be scientifically illiterate, but you illiterate too. And those words stay with me forever. So thank you for the invite, and thank you for allowing me to share my ideas about and vision about where I think as cancer centers and academic cancer centers, we can contribute to reducing disparities. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for a really spectacular and highly in-depth talk, Dr. Winn. It's spectacular. This is Mike Titel. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Okay, good. I can't see myself on the screen, so I'm just making sure that's the case. We had a few questions as well as a comment in the chat. I understand two of the questions. I don't understand the third. The comment was, you know, as you might imagine, what a spectacular talk. So thank you for that from that one attendee, Beth Glenn. Another question that came up was, it seems like poverty and financial access are big drivers in some of the health disparities that you described. What can we do to improve this despite not having a unified healthcare system like some other countries seem to?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I do think this is where grace and humility come in. And I think you're starting to do part of it, right? You're starting to move out into the neighborhoods and work with our community health centers. I think that the community health centers have languished in a way as a result of having lack of resources that sometimes I get really frustrated, because to be quite honest with you, in Chicago, I was able to, we had a unique situation with the University of Illinois co-owned and operated its own network of federally qualified health centers. So putting the research and putting other things in that and doing things together really was an interesting sort of foray into this. It's not going to be easy to actually resource and redirect money, but it is for many of our centers to be able to partner with groups that are already there. I think, again, that's not going to be a satisfying answer. It's not going to do everything, but it is at least a start. And getting back to the issue, the financial and poverty are big drivers. So unless we're starting to talk about how we can actually start providing more jobs for the people in our communities, which I've actually started that discussion, having something on this campus that says every grant that you write that actually involves a community, how are you hiring somebody from the community? Again, it's a little start, but it's something that we're starting to try to think about doing here at VCU Massey to get us at least in the habit of thinking about, as we do bigger and bigger things, how do we actually employ people and how do we work with our partners, especially our political partners, in figuring out how we can provide more jobs.
Thank you for that. And thank you also for staying with us. I know we're over time. We appreciate you staying with us. Another question that came from an attendee was, when running association studies, how do we account for demographic disparities when we don't always have this information in our genetic data sets?
we got to get better on that. In fact, I've been working with the NHTIR in the context of moving forward, and actually, it's a very good question. I do think it's frustrating. You're going to have holes within your data sets, but I think as we're starting to think about this more, and this is what the work that I'm doing with SAS, as we're starting to think about this more, we are actually starting to be much more deliberate before we actually engage communities in figuring out what we're going to need to be able to get better data around developing our genetic databases. This is also one of the shortcomings of most of the African Americans and minorities getting tested, even rural folk. I mean, bottom line is the genetic testing for many of these groups is still lagging behind. And that's not because, this is like clinical trials. It's not because they wouldn't say yes, it's because we're not asking and we're not doing. So part of this is really not just on individuals in those neighborhoods. Part of this is on, we could do a better job asking and getting people involved in this type of testing.
Another attendee gives an emphatic thank you, Dr. Winn. What are your thoughts on how we can shift science to value the understanding of structural and social factors related to health?
I think we're doing that now. I think adopting this people to pipette model, looking at the genome or the DNA and the impact on the DNA and biology is the science. And as many more of us throughout the country start, grappling with the interplay between the DNA and DNA, I think we'll start actually improving our conversations around this.
The other comment the same attendee made was, the siloed nature of research implies that it's optional and not important to consider these factors when studying genomics and other biological research.
It ain't gonna be silent for too much longer. We're gonna, it's like what do you say? Coach Lombardi, when he went to Green Bay, but his daughter sort of said, well, who knows where Green Bay is? And he finally sort of said, well, when we get to Green Bay, everybody will know. The bottom line is it's up to us right now to bring that attention. And we're going to continue to talk about this.
From your friend, Tony Rivas. How should we incorporate the social determinants of health to the staging of patients with cancer and decisions on how to deliver care to patients of underserved communities?
I actually think that's a great question. And this is where we're starting to actually really get that interplay between the epigenetics, the structure, and not just the social determinants of health, but looking at it. And that's why I'm literally quoting this phrase or terming this phrase and making this phrase up, the genome, right? The multiple parts. So there's a structure, right? The interplay between those social determinants of health, that actual stress that they're living in, the microbiome, all those things are actually playing, but yet we don't really think about the collection of those things and the intersectionality of those things and how they're impacting biology. I really would love to be able to work with groups and figuring out even more how to unpack that so that we can actually come with a more, I think, comprehensive approach. But it's a great question.
Thank you. Last question, last comment too. Thank you for a wonderful presentation and the reminders to be humble. Do you think it is harder to solve poverty than travel through space, or that it just requires political and social will that we lack?
It's like a diet. Health disparities is like a diet. We know how to lose weight. We know the benefits of losing weight. And we have, God knows, lots of ways and programs that were started even before the 80s that we showed would work. But similar to a diet, we know it's good to lose weight. We even know there's 10,000 ways of losing weight. And the reality is, if you only committed to one, you lose weight. This is an issue of 1969. How much further have we come? A little bit, but we're still putting people in space, and we still have issues in poverty that are only going to get worse with COVID. So this is a real issue here about our political will and about academic centers making sure that these issues are not forgotten. And that's going to be the challenge for us here at Massey, and I hope others around the country.
Well, your presence with us today is truly inspiring. The depth and breadth of your knowledge and what's important, I think, to all of us, certainly here at UCLA and at our cancer center, is greatly appreciated. Thank you for sharing all of your wisdom and insight, and I hope we can tap into that wisdom and insight going forward as well. Great pleasure having you here today.
Thank you, guys.